Privet. I'm Klара Moritz, author of the book In Stravinsky's Orbit, Responses to Modernism in Russian Paris. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to introduce my book to Russian readers. When I began working on this project, my aim was to write about the life and works of forgotten Russian composers, talented musicians who, after leaving revolutionary Russia, could never recover from the loss of their homeland. I wanted to give them back their voice that got lost in the struggle for survival in emigration. It did not take me long to realize that it was not possible to write such a book. More precisely, it was not possible to tell the story without mapping it on the story of what happened to the most famous Russian emigrant composer, Igor Stravinsky. Stravinsky thus became the central figure in my book of Russian emigrant composers in Paris. He demarcated the cultural space for Russian composers and defined their artistic agendas. My four protagonists, Vladimir Dukelsky, Sergei Prokofiev, Nicholas Nabokov, and Arthur Lurie, had all positioned themselves vis-à-vis Stravinsky. Dukelsky was the youngest and luckiest. Arriving to Paris from the United States, the first stop on his journey in exile, he quickly received an audition with Diaghilev and his musical high priest, Stravinsky. He passed the exam and landed an unexpected ballet commission, Zephyr and Flora. It was not a huge success. Dukelsky was too young and inexperienced to make a breakthrough, but it made an impression. He was even luckier that he moved on quickly to write in a more popular vein, and thus carved out for himself an unusual path to success for a Russian emigrant. Changing his name to Vernon Duke signaled his willingness to leave his Russian past behind. And yet even Dukelsky succumbed to nostalgia and wrote an oratorio about the lost St. Petersburg. The circuitous route of composing and performing the oratorio showed the difficulties emigrant composers encountered when they yielded to nostalgia. Dukelsky's The End of St. Petersburg was inspired by Vsevolod Pudovkin's 1928 propaganda film about the transformation of the imperial capital into the cradle of the revolution. But all the film did for Dukelsky was to awaken his longing for Russia's former capital. Pudovkin was showing St. Petersburg to erase the imperial capital. Dukelsky created his oratorio to recreate its memory in music. When negotiations about the oratorio's premiere in Paris stalled, he turned to his friend Prokofiev to secure a performance in Soviet Russia. Even the politically naive Prokofiev knew that Dukelsky's emigrant nostalgia had no place in Stalin's Russia, even with the addition of a bombastic setting of a Mayakovsky poem. More surprisingly, the oratorio had no place in Paris either, where during the World Exhibition in 1937, Soviet voices were loud enough to repress Dukelsky's oratorio. The work premiered in English translation in New York in 1938 in front of an audience that had no understanding of the importance of St. Petersburg in the emigrant imagination. Prokofiev faced a similar dilemma with his Bolshevik ballet Pas d'Acier. In Paris, critics took it as a failed attempt to turn the Bolshevik experience into an item of exoticism. In London, recently hit by a general strike, some feared that Prokofiev was promoting Bolshevism. His ballet could never receive a Soviet performance because his presentation of Bolshevism was offensive to Soviet officials. Few noticed the underlying irony of Prokofiev poking fun at Stravinsky, his greatest rival, by transforming the idea of old Slavic primitivism in The Rite of Spring into the presentation of the primitive mass men created by Soviet ideology. Nostalgia and modernism, one tainted with the past, the other associated with Bolshevik progressivism, were both proved dead ends for emigrant composers. Again, it was Stravinsky who figured out how to move beyond this dichotomy. His neoclassicism proposed an artistic vision that, while preserving its Russian roots, also fit into post-war Paris. Although Nicholas Nabokov's ballet Ode was neoclassical, it was still too freighted with nostalgia for Russia's aristocratic past. Stravinsky found the perfect solution in his ballet Apollo, which premiered in 1928, the same year as Nabokov's Ode. I argue that Stravinsky's neoclassicism in Apollo was not only a post-war, post-traumatic artistic response that corresponded to French artistic trends, but also Stravinsky's own solution to a problem created by emigration. Modernism tamed, national identity neutralized, nostalgia pushed into the background. Stravinsky's neoclassicism succeeded at sidestepping the debilitating condition of exile. Arthur Luria, the last of my protagonists, is the most forgotten of these composers. A close associate of Stravinsky in the late 1920s and early 1930s, he gradually distanced himself from his famous compatriot. His opera ballet, A Feast in Time of Plague, would have been performed in the Paris Opera had the war not intervened. Luria's gradual disappearance from the musical scene was the fate of many other Russian emigrants who perished in the centrifugal force of Stravinsky's frequently changing aesthetics. By the end of the 1930s, Paris, like St. Petersburg before it, emptied out of its Russian intellectual elite. Like the former capital of Imperial Russia, it became a city haunted by its departed Russian inhabitants, who yet again withdrew into the illusory space of memory. For Russian emigrants, Stravinsky's conversion to 12-tone music in the United States signals his final severing of his ties with the Russian community in exile. His final betrayal deprived Russian music abroad of its center. But the increased brilliance of Stravinsky's fame in the United States was deceptive. It signaled the end phase of a star that, as it shines brighter and brighter, shed its outer layers, thus loosening its gravitational hold on its planets. Russian composers who had orbited around Stravinsky in the 1920s and 1930s drifted away and became scattered in search of a new identity. Спасибо.